Somewhere between the spring of 1812 and the autumn of 1834, the world that built the cathedrals, the canal systems, the symmetrical port cities, and the engraved coinage of 3 continents ceased to exist. Not in a single explosion, not in a recorded war that earned its own chapter in the textbooks you were handed at school. It ended quietly. It ended in pieces. And the people who lived through it left behind a very strange kind of testimony, fragments of personal diaries, parish entries that stop in one hand and resume months later in another, ledgers that balance to 0 on a Tuesday and start again from page 1 on a Wednesday, port records that list ships arriving with no listed origin, small newspaper notices that describe entire trades disappearing in a single winter. For 2 centuries we have been told that this period was an age of industry, of reason, of measured progress toward the modern world. But the survivors, the ones who actually wrote about what they saw with their own eyes, used a very different word. They called it, I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Wrote about it the way a man writes about a country he can no longer find on the map. The first thing you have to understand is that 1812 is not the year you think it is. In the standard telling, 1812 belongs to Napoleon and to his march on Moscow, and it belongs to the small naval war between Britain and the young American Republic. These are the events that fill the chapter, these are the events the maps will show you. But if you read the parish records of Central Europe for that year, you find something else entirely. You find a sudden and unexplained gap in births that runs from January to May across at least 7 jurisdictions. You find ledgers from grain merchants in Hamburg, in Riga, in Bordeaux that record shipments arriving from ports no current historian can confidently identify. You find letters between minor nobles describing what they call the Long Quiet, a stretch of weeks in which the post stopped, the markets thinned, and the church bells in entire valleys were not rung because no one was left in the rectories to ring them. None of this appears in the famous accounts of the Russian campaign. None of it appears in the standard economic histories of the period. It survives only in the margin notes, in the personal correspondence, in the kind of evidence that historians have traditionally dismissed as anecdotal. But when you gather the anecdotes from 20 separate regions and you lay them side by side, the picture they form is not anecdotal at all. The picture they form is the picture of a continent that lost a significant portion of its working population in a few short months, and then quietly reorganized itself around the absence. Then came 1815. The official record gives you Waterloo. The official record gives you the defeat of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, and the redrawing of the European map. What the official record does not give you, except in the most technical of geological journals, is that in April of that year, a mountain in the Dutch East Indies named Tambora produced the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The ash from Tambora circled the globe. It dimmed the sun for 3 years. It produced what the survivors in New England called the year without a summer, in which snow fell in June and crops failed across the entire northern hemisphere. And here is the part that the economic textbooks do not connect for you. The same year that Tambora went off, the same year that the harvest failed across 2 continents, was the year that a single banking family in London, having received early word of the outcome at Waterloo through private courier, executed what would become the largest concentrated transfer of European wealth in a single afternoon. The old aristocratic fortunes, the ones tied to land and to grain and to local mints, collapsed in price. The new fortunes, the ones tied to paper, to government debt, to centralized credit, were purchased at pennies on the pound. By the time the dust from Tambora settled and the first warm summer returned in 1818, the financial topography of Europe had been completely rewritten. The old houses were gone, the old guilds were gone, the old local currencies were gone, and almost no one had noticed because almost no one had survived the winter to notice. The survivors who did write about it wrote in fragments. A merchant in Lyon recorded in his private journal that the grain price in his city tripled in 11 days and then collapsed to nothing because there were no buyers left. A pastor in Württemberg wrote that he buried more parishioners in the autumn of 1816 than he had buried in the previous 11 years combined. A clerk in the Bank of England, in a letter to his brother that was preserved by accident in a family Bible, wrote that the volume of foreign coin being melted down in the basement of the bank that winter was so great that the furnaces had to be run continuously for 9 months, and that the coins arriving came from mints he had never heard of, bearing the heads of monarchs whose names appeared on no current list. He used a peculiar phrase. He wrote that the bank was unmaking a world. By 1819 the consequences had reached the New World. What the textbooks call the Panic of 1819 is treated as the first major financial crisis of the young American Republic, a localized event tied to land speculation and to the unwinding of war debts. But the Panic of 1819 was not local. It was the moment when the wave that had begun in Central Europe in 1812 and that had been amplified by Tambora in 1815 finally crossed the Atlantic and broke against the eastern seaboard. Banks that had stood since the previous century closed in a single week. Plantations changed hands at fractions of their listed value. Entire towns in the Ohio Valley were abandoned and never resettled by the families who had built them. The Second Bank of the United States, founded only 3 years earlier, called in its loans with such suddenness that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would later write that the bank had broken the country in order to save itself. And again, the survivors recorded something stranger than the official narrative captures. They recorded the arrival of people they could not identify. Refugees, the newspapers called them. Refugees from where? The newspapers did not say. Men and women and small children who spoke languages no one in the receiving ports could place, who carried coins from no recognized treasury, who had skills in trades that had no current market, because the trades themselves no longer existed. They were absorbed quietly into the labor pools of New York and Philadelphia and Charleston. Their origins were not investigated, their numbers were not recorded. And within a generation their grandchildren were simply American, with no memory of where their families had come from. This pattern of unrecorded migration is one of the great omissions of standard 19th century history. Between 1819 and 1825, multiple major Atlantic ports recorded ship arrivals whose passenger manifests have either gone missing entirely or were never filed in the first place. The customs records of Boston for the year 1821 show a gap of 4 months in which arriving vessels were logged by tonnage and cargo, but not by origin. The same is true of Liverpool for portions of 1822. The same is true of Hamburg, Antwerp, and the smaller German ports of Bremen and Lübeck. In aggregate, what these gaps describe is the movement of hundreds of thousands of people across the Atlantic, in a period in which the official immigration statistics record only tens of thousands. The historians who have noticed this gap have generally attributed it to clerical disorder. But clerical disorder does not normally produce silence in this many archives at once. Clerical disorder does not normally affect the same 4 months in 3 different countries. In 1821, the Bank of England formally returned to the gold standard, a policy decision that is treated in most economic histories as a technical adjustment of monetary policy. In practical terms, what it meant was that every paper note in circulation that could not be backed by a fixed quantity of bullion held in the vaults of the bank became overnight a liability. The smaller country banks, the private mints, the local exchange houses that had operated in the British countryside for over a century simply could not produce the gold required. They closed. Their notes became worthless. Their customers lost the savings of multiple generations in a single quarter. And the consolidation of British banking around a small number of London houses, the consolidation that would define the financial architecture of the entire 19th century, was completed not by competition but by the policy adjustment of a single afternoon. The same year, on the other side of the world, the Hudson's Bay Company merged with the North West Company, ending a commercial rivalry that had dominated the Canadian fur trade for 2 generations. The new combined company received a royal charter that granted it monopoly trading rights over a territory roughly the size of continental Europe. The men who had run the old North West Company, the voyageurs and the bourgeois traders who had built that network over 40 years, were retired with small pensions or were quietly disappeared from the corporate record. Their warehouses were burned, their inventories were rewritten. The maps they had drawn of the northern interior were classified and locked in company archives in London, where they would not be examined again for over 100 years. The cholera arrived in 1826. The first wave moved out of the Bengal Delta, travelled along the trade routes of the East India Company, and reached the Russian frontier by 1829. From there it moved into Poland, into Prussia, into Austria, into France, into Britain, and finally across the Atlantic into Quebec and New York by 1832. The official death toll, as recorded in the parish books and the city registries that survived, ran into the millions. The unofficial death toll, the toll that includes the people whose deaths were not recorded because the recording officials had themselves died, will never be known. What we do know is that in the cities most heavily affected, in Paris and in Berlin and in St. Petersburg and in London and in New York, the cholera years produced a near-complete turnover in the small merchant class, in the artisan guilds, and in the apprentice trades that had passed down knowledge through 3 or 4 generations of unbroken transmission. The blacksmiths who had served particular streets for a century closed their shops. The cabinet makers, the silversmiths, the masons who knew how to dress a particular kind of stone, the millwrights who knew how to balance a particular kind of wheel, all of them died in numbers wildly disproportionate to the general population, because their workshops were located in the dense river districts where the cholera moved fastest. When the disease finally burned itself out in 1834, the trades that returned to those streets were not the same trades. The men who set up the new shops were younger, they were from outside the city, they had been trained in factories rather than in family workshops, and the techniques they used were the standardized industrial techniques of the new century, not the inherited techniques of the old. This is the part of the story that the revisionist economic historians have been pointing at for decades, although they have generally been ignored or dismissed by the mainstream. The argument is not that the cholera was deliberate. The argument is that the cholera, combined with the financial consolidations, combined with the unrecorded migrations, combined with the policy adjustments around gold and currency and trade monopoly, produced a transformation of the working economy of the Western world that would have been politically impossible under normal conditions. You cannot simply order the disappearance of the artisan guilds. You cannot simply legislate the consolidation of 300 local banks into 4 London houses. You cannot simply decree that the inherited knowledge of stone dressing or coin striking or shipbuilding be replaced by factory standards within a single generation. These changes require either centuries of slow adjustment, or they require an event so disruptive that the previous arrangements physically cannot continue. The years between 1812 and 1834 were that event, and the people who lived through them and wrote about them understood that they were that event, even if their descendants would forget within 2 generations. In 1825, the Russian throne passed from Alexander to Nicholas under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. Alexander died in Taganrog, far from his capital, under medical care provided by physicians whose names were redacted from the... Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Official death certificate. The body was placed in a sealed coffin and transported north under armed guard. 3 independent witnesses, 2 of them members of the imperial household staff, would later write privately that the body in the coffin was not the body of the emperor. The Decembrist revolt that followed the succession was suppressed within 48 hours, but the conspirators, when interrogated, repeatedly described their grievances, using a phrase that the official transcripts translated as constitutional liberty, but that in the original Russian was closer to the restoration of what was lost. They were not asking for the future, they were asking for the past. They were asking for a version of their country that had existed before something had been taken from it, and they were prepared to die to recover it. 5 of them were hanged, the rest were sent to Siberia. Their writings, where they survived, were sealed in state archives until the 20th century. There is another category of evidence that the revisionist economic historians have begun to assemble in recent years, and it concerns the physical infrastructure of the period itself. Across multiple European and American cities, surveyors have documented buildings whose construction dates in the official municipal records do not match the dates etched into the cornerstones, do not match the dates recorded in the diaries of local residents, and do not match the dates that appear in the insurance ledgers of the firms that issued policies on the structures. The discrepancies are not small. They are often a matter of decades. In Boston, in Philadelphia, in Hamburg, in St. Petersburg, in Edinburgh, there are public buildings whose municipal records show them as built in the 1830s or 1840s, but whose foundations were drawn on city maps printed in the 1790s. The official explanation is that the maps were aspirational, that they showed planned construction that was eventually completed decades later. The survivor testimony, where it exists, tells a different story. It describes buildings that were already standing in the early years of the century, that were damaged or abandoned during the disruptions of the 1810s and 1820s, and that were quietly attributed to later builders once the previous attributions had faded from living memory. Whether this reattribution was deliberate or accidental, the effect was the same. A significant portion of the inherited architecture of the Western world was assigned to constructors who could not possibly have built it within the timeframes claimed. In 1830, a revolution removed the senior branch of the Bourbon dynasty from the French throne and installed in its place a junior branch under Louis Philippe, who would be known as the citizen king and who would preside over what the French historians call the bourgeois monarchy. The phrase is precise. The previous monarchy had been tied, however imperfectly, to land and to inherited title and to the structures of the old regime. The new monarchy was tied to banking and to industry and to the new financial houses that had emerged from the rearrangements of the previous 15 years. The same year, the German Confederation experienced a wave of small uprisings that the textbooks describe as the precursors to 1848, but that the participants themselves described as the last attempt to reverse a transformation that had already happened. They were not trying to make a new world, they were trying to keep an old one from disappearing entirely. They failed. The old order in Germany dissolved over the next 18 years, without ceremony. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which formally ended chattel slavery throughout most of the British Empire, effective the following year. This is correctly remembered as a moral achievement. What is less often remembered is the financial mechanism through which it was accomplished. The Act provided for the compensation of slave owners for the loss of their property, in an amount equal to 40% of the British national budget for that year. The money was raised by issuing government bonds that would not be fully paid off until the year 2015. The bonds were purchased primarily by the same small group of London banking houses that had consolidated the financial system in the preceding 2 decades, and the interest payments on those bonds flowed into those houses for the next 182 years. The enslaved persons themselves received nothing. The compensation went entirely to the former owners, and through them to the bondholders. By this mechanism, the largest single transfer of public money to private hands in 19th century British history was successfully presented as a moral reform. The men who had financed the consolidation of the old order received the funds that, in a more transparent system, would have been used to compensate the people whose lives had been stolen. By 1834, the world that had existed in 1812 was gone. The old guilds were dissolved, the local banks were absorbed, the artisan trades were industrialized, the aristocratic estates had been quietly mortgaged to the new banking houses or sold outright to the new industrial fortunes. The currencies of 3 continents had been standardized around the gold reserves of a small number of central banks. The populations of the major cities had been turned over twice, once by cholera, and once by the unrecorded migrations that had filled the gap. The maps had been redrawn, the trade routes had been redirected, the institutions that had defined the previous 2 centuries had either ceased to exist or had been hollowed out and refilled with personnel loyal to the new arrangement, and almost no one outside the small circle of men who had executed the transformation understood that any transformation had occurred. The newspapers reported each event separately. The histories that would be written over the following decades would treat each event as unrelated to the others. The pattern would only be visible from a distance of 200 years, looking back across the entire span of the period, and it would be visible then only to researchers willing to read the survivor testimony alongside the official record. The survivor testimony is the part that haunts. There is a letter in the Bavarian State Archive, written in 1828 by an elderly woman to her grandson who had emigrated to America, in which she tells him not to come home because the home he remembers is no longer there. She uses the German word verschwunden, which means vanished, but which also carries the implication of having been taken. She describes streets he played in as a child that no longer exist, churches he was baptized in that have been pulled down, neighbours whose families had lived in the same houses for 4 generations who are simply gone with no record of where they went. She writes that the new people in the town are polite but distant, that they do not know the old stories, that they do not celebrate the old feast days, that they speak the language with a slightly different accent. She closes the letter by saying that she is the last one left who remembers, and that when she dies, the town that was will die with her. There is a similar letter in a Boston archive from a sea captain who had spent 40 years in the Atlantic trade, writing in 1831 to a younger colleague. He tells the younger man that the ports he used to call at no longer recognize his old codes, that the harbour masters who used to greet him by name are dead or retired, that the warehouses where his cargo used to be unloaded are now owned by companies he has never heard of, and that the prices he is offered are set by men in offices in London and New York whom he will never meet. He writes that he feels like a ghost walking through his own life, performing the motions of a profession that no longer exists in the form he learned it. He retired the following year and refused to discuss his earlier career with his children. There is a journal in a Russian provincial archive kept by a parish priest in a small town near the Volga that records the years from 1820 to 1835 in unbroken weekly entries. The early entries describe the ordinary business of a country parish, baptisms and marriages and burials and the changing of the seasons. The entries from 1895 onward become progressively stranger. He writes about people arriving in the town who have no documents and no clear origin. He writes about the disappearance of 3 families from the surrounding villages, with their houses left intact and their belongings undisturbed, as if they had simply walked out one morning. He writes about a winter in which the church records from the neighbouring parish 20 kilometres away, arrived by courier with 2 years of entries written in a hand that did not match any of the priests known to have served there. He writes in the final entry of the journal that he does not understand what is happening to his country, that the official explanations do not match what he is seeing with his own eyes, and that he prays for the souls of those who have been forgotten. He died of cholera the following summer. What ties these testimonies together is not a single conspiracy. It is something more troubling than a single conspiracy. It is the recognition, recorded in dozens of separate hands across dozens of separate jurisdictions, that something fundamental had broken in the working order of the world, and that the official sources were either unable or unwilling to describe it. The men and women who wrote these letters and journals and ledger margins were not theorists. They were not radicals. They were merchants and priests and clerks and sea captains, people whose lives depended on understanding the systems they worked within, and they were unanimous in their judgment that the systems had been replaced. Not reformed, not improved, replaced. The standard objection to this kind of analysis is that history is always a story of change, and that any 22-year period can be made to look like a great transformation if you select the right examples. There is some truth to this objection, but the period between 1812 and 1834 is unusual in 3 specific ways that distinguish it from ordinary historical change. First, the rate of institutional turnover, measured by the number of banks, guilds, trading companies and noble houses that ceased to exist, was approximately 4 times higher than the rate in the 2 decades before or the 2 decades after. Second, the demographic disruption, measured by recorded deaths, undocumented migrations and gaps in population records, was the highest in any peacetime period in the previous 3 centuries. Third, the consolidation of financial control, measured by the share of total credit issued by the top 5 banking houses in each major capital, increased from roughly 15% in 1812 to roughly 70% by 1834. These are not the numbers of an ordinary historical period. These are the numbers of a controlled demolition. Whether that demolition was orchestrated by identifiable actors, or whether it emerged from the convergence of natural disasters, financial panics, disease outbreaks, and policy decisions that happened to align in the same window, is a question the historical record cannot fully answer. What the historical record can answer is that the demolition happened, that the survivors knew it was happening, that they recorded their knowledge in private documents because the public sources would not, and that the world we live in today is the world that was built on the ground they cleared. Our banks descend from their banks. Our currencies descend from their currencies. Our trades descend from their factories, not from the workshops that the factories replaced. Our cities are laid out on the streets they widened. Our institutions answer to the consolidations they completed. The old world ended somewhere between 1812 and 1834. The survivors reported it in letters that their grandchildren never read, in journals that were sealed in archives, in ledger margins that future clerks copied without understanding. They reported it with the particular kind of grief that comes from watching a familiar order disappear in real time while the official voices around you insist that nothing unusual is happening. We owe them the willingness to consider that they were not confused, that they were not exaggerating, and that the world they remembered was a real world, and that it really did end. If this investigation has changed the way you think about the 19th century, please share it with someone who will appreciate the research. Leave a comment below telling us which detail surprised you the most, and which survivor testimony you would like us to examine more closely in a future investigation. Subscribe to follow this work. The next investigation will examine what happened to the maps that were redrawn in the 1820s, and why so many of the original drafts have never been released to the public. Thank you for watching.